Hi, I'm Patrick Watson. I'm an astrologer, and you're watching BigFatAstroVlog. And today we're going to be talking about Donald Trump's Zodiacal releasing again. So the last conclusion that I had about Donald Trump's chart after the election was that using his chart to predict with Zodiacal releasing was always going to be a bit dodgy because the rulers and positions of his lot of fortune and lot of spirit technically fall amiss. So the results of his chart were always going to be less clear. But this always kind of seemed a little bit like a cop-out, even though this is more or less what the progenitor of this technique tells us. Vedic Valens says that the lots aren't always telling if the lot and its lord fall amiss, which is the case in Trump's chart. As you can see, this is Trump's chart right here. He has a lot of fortune in the whole sign 7th, but its ruler falls amiss in the 12th. And then the lot of spirit falls amiss in the 8th, and then its ruler Jupiter is cadent relative to the first. Now, this isn't a total deal breaker, but it just means that this is what led to me thinking that perhaps these conditions applied to his chart. So lately, I have been thinking about an alternate way to look at the lots in Donald Trump's chart. The lots of fortune and spirit are based on the arc between the sun and the moon in the chart. So if the sun is above the horizon, then you use a diurnal calculation for the chart. If the sun is below the horizon, you generally use a nocturnal calculation. Now, there is one little wrinkle, which Vedic Valens mentions. He says that in a nocturnal birth, that you only use the nocturnal formula if the moon is also above the horizon. Then it's truly a nocturnal chart. So it's clear that, the calculation of fortune and spirit, is somewhat contingent upon the visibility of the sun and the moon. And so this question of why Donald Trump's chart why his Zodiacal releasing didn't really show a win in 2016, when clearly that's what happened, that really vexed me, really kind of stressed me out, because I've had so much success with this technique, and I kind of wondered, why isn't this technique working for this chart? And I'll show you why. In a very simple explanation, why is if his fortune is an Aquarius, which it is, using the conventional diurnal calculation for his chart because he was born during the day, the fixed signs are the signs which are supposed to be more angular. Those are the signs which we might expect someone to rise to a high station in their lives. So Aquarius would be the sign of fortune, Taurus would be fortune 4th, Leo would be fortune 7th, and Scorpio would be fortune 10th. So I would expect from the position of his fortune that he might do something like become president under an angular period, as has happened for so many of his predecessors. Pardon me. So for so many of his for so many of his presidential predecessors. Oh God. All right. So what happened is if we look at his spirit releasing, we would expect him to become president under one of these angular periods. And instead, what happened is at the time of the election, November 6th or November 8th, rather, 2016, he was in a Cancer major period, which would be cadent relative to fortune, which is like the exact opposite of what you'd expect. There is a contact to the Lord of Fortune, but it's quite weak, considering it's Saturn in the 12th. This is not what we would expect to see from his chart. And not only that, but after the election, he had this giant loosening of the bond on December 28th, 2017, and nothing really approximating what some people were thinking was going to happen happened at that time period. So I mean, some people might just say, well, this is evidence this technique doesn't work, or this is just evidence astrology doesn't work. But, notwithstanding those criticisms, I think that this technique still has something to offer us. But we have to take into account the position of fortune and spirit and go back to the issue of visibility. Because something else about Trump's birth that I hadn't put two and two together until very recently is the fact that, fortune is the lot of the moon, and a lot of spirit is a lot of the sun, and their positions in the chart are based on their relationship to each other. Well, what happens in a chart where the moon is eclipsed? Trump was born during a lunar eclipse. You see how the sun is close to the north node, where that's the intersection of the sun's path and the moon's path. Yeah, well, the moon's on the opposite end. So it's technically a full moon, but because it's aligned with their paths where they meet, that produces a lunar eclipse, where the Earth's shadow covers part of the moon. So what becomes of the lot of the moon, the lot of fortune, when the moon itself is obscured? Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I mean, the only modification I think makes any kind of sense is maybe if you were born during a solar eclipse during the day, that maybe you'd get a nocturnal calculation. But I can't really reason why anything should be reversed during the day if the moon is eclipsed beneath the horizon. But it's a curious enough idea that I considered, well, what happens if you switch fortune and spirit? What if, because technically the moon's light is gone in Trump's chart, what happens to the position of fortune? Because it's no longer, there's no light left. So the moon's position in some sense is like undefined or something. So anyway, I just had the idea, what would happen if you switch? So what would happen if you switched is, instead of having the fixed signs be the signs which are angular to fortune, instead, fortune would be in Pisces and the lot of spirit would be in Aquarius. So that would mean that all of the mutable signs would become the pivotal signs in Zodiacal releasing. So Pisces would be the fortune first, Gemini would be the fortune fourth, Virgo would be the fortune seventh, and Sagittarius would be the fortune 10th. And when I did this, I came across something fairly interesting. So in this chart, we just have to basically imagine that this is actually the fortune symbol and this is actually the spirit symbol. So if we pretend that the mutable signs are actually the fortune angles, something kind of interesting happens. So we're going to release from fortune so that our fortune releasing starts, our spirit releasing starts from Aquarius relative to Pisces. Well, he spends the first 30 years of his life in an Aquarius period. And then not long before he turns 30, he goes into his first angular period, which was 1976 through 1987. And of course, this is probably that's roughly around, the beginning of his kind of golden period of the 80s, where he was kind of this celebrity and where he was, kind of more liked, more popular. Jupiter ruled the period. So that, isn't a bad period for him. Then he went into a 15-year Aries period from 1987 to 2002. So this Aries period would maybe be slightly more contentious since it's ruled by Mars, and Mars is contrary to Sect Malefic. And this kind of encapsulates his 90s period, essentially, which was a bit more difficult for him. He had his first bankruptcies, a few more problems, kind of more negative press attention, sort of became a bit more trashy as opposed to the kind of celebrity businessman wunderkind, image he had in the 80s. And then the Taurus period began in 2002 and went to 2010. Now, what's really interesting about that is the fact that that basically encapsulates his time as a reality TV star. The show began, I think, in 2003 or 2004. Apprentice did. And, it was just an 8-year period where he was kind of this just, goofy TV show host. And then things get interesting because in 2010, that's when he entered his next angular period, a 20-year angular period. So this is a period that if we were looking at his chart in this way, before he had run for president or anything, we'd probably say, oh, this is another really big peak in his career. So it was in like 2011 that he began the birtherism shit. Basically, this Gemini period more or less begins before he starts making these moves and statements in politics that actually start kind of generating some buzz around himself. And it coincides with this, I guess, angular period in Gemini. And of course, it contains his sun and his Uranus. And this is when he's, making his way towards potentially a high office, or at least high visibility. And this is visible in a way that it completely is not if you're looking at the fixed signs as the fortune angles. But if you look at his fortune angles as the mutable signs, then it becomes a bit clearer. Then, if we go down to the subperiods for the 2016 election, he was in a Virgo subperiod. So again, he was on another angle. So he was on an angular period on the major level, as well as an angular period on the sub-level for the 2016 election. So this is much more in line with what we might expect for someone to have if they were actually reaching these kind of levels of fame. We would at least expect some angularity, some involvement of the fortune 10th or the ruler of the lot of spirit, something like that. And so I think this is a bit more clear than if you look at the fixed signs as the fortune angles. So if we actually look at the specific date of the election, November 8th, 2016, we see that he is in a Gemini L3 period. So not only is he in a Gemini major period, which is angular to fortune in Pisces, but then he's also in an angular period on level 2, fortune 7th, and then he repeats the major period level, Gemini, on level 3, and then has just passed a fortune 10th period, which it ended before the voting actually began, but it essentially it's close enough to a major activation of his fortune 10th that by the time he reaches the election, he's in this Capricorn period, which on the one hand is kind of bad because it's opposed by Saturn, but on the other hand, it's Jupiter is in superior position to Capricorn, so that would technically be one of his better periods. And so that is when he won, and it's just a bit more clear now with looking at his angles in terms of the mutable signs instead of the fixed signs. And the only reason I can think of why you would do that is if we had to take into account that his moon is eclipsed, and for some reason we would flip essentially fortune and spirit. What's also particularly interesting about this is the fact that if we look ahead towards the 2020 elections, we can see that he is in a fortune 10th period leading up to those 2020 elections, which would be his next big peak. And then the 2020 elections themselves would happen under a Capricorn period, which is the same L4 period that he actually won the first election under. So, I mean, I'd have to see exactly what his challenges releasing would look like, because we would expect perhaps a good period for Trump to be in or at least a very visible period for him to be in, even if he lost. But it's going to be, I think that there is still something to be said between like comparing two people's charts and seeing how, I don't know, eminent or prominent or visible, how good their periods are compared to the candidate they're against. And I think I'd just have to look at that before making a definitive declaration, like now that he might potentially win in 2020. But I mean, I don't even know if this theory is valid at all yet, that his fortune angles should really be the mutable signs. But I do think it's important to consider like what happens to the lots when the sun and the moon, or the sun or the moon rather, are eclipsed. And I think there's just a little bit of an interesting glimmer of possibility here, something to show for the idea that in Trump's chart, his lots really may have to be flipped in order to make his 2016 win intelligible. Because if we consider his fortune to be in the fixed signs, then the 2016 election makes no sense because it happens under a cadent period and it's just not what we would expect. Whereas if we take into account that his moon is eclipsed and therefore this affects his lot of fortune in some way and switches places with Spirit for some reason, then interestingly, his Zodiacal releasing periods, his adjusted periods, basically pretending as if his lot of Spirit was actually his lot of fortune, he ends up being in very angular periods in a time of his life when he has ascended to a much higher level of visibility and prominence than he has ever been in his life. And he was already, a very famous, well-known, prominent person. So I realized that this video might have gone above some of your heads. You have to have a bit of background information on Zodiacal releasing to understand all of this. But for all those of you who understand what I'm talking about, let me know what you think in the comments. Do you think that the lunar eclipse that Donald Trump was born under, do you think that might affect his Zodiacal releasing and what sign we use as his fortune and his Spirit? Let me know what you think in the comments. And again, if you want to see content like this, I am still making videos, even though I have long breaks in between. I do articles here and them, but I appreciate all the support that I get on Patreon, and I want to keep it coming for you. So even if you just support me with $1, that's really, really great. It helps me be able to continue to do astrological research and create these videos for you to watch. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.